All righty. So we'll just start with, what is a letter of recommendation? Just there are many different kinds of ways to view, letter evaluations, letter of recommendations. There's many different ways schools and like admissions officers describe these. So letters of recommendation or evaluation, they're confidential letters sent directly to the application service or health professional school by individuals on your behalf. And so they communicate things such as your qualities, your competencies, your capabilities as a future healthcare professional from the perspective of someone who knows you. So, my question to you all right now is how much of an impact do you all think a letter of rec has on your application? So, you can unmute, you can put it in the chat. I'm just kind of curious to see what everyone thinks, how impactful letters of rec are.
Um, I feel like it's one of like the strongest parts of your application, if not the personal statement as well. But I feel like personal statement plus letters of rec um, are a pretty good revelation of who you are as an applicant.
Yeah, yeah, good answer. Anybody else have any other? They're not the most important aspect. They can break an app though if you get a bad one. Okay, so we've got two opinions. Anybody else want to throw out another opinion or
Um,
guess?
I was thinking that they can help strengthen or I guess confirm whatever you said about your own self, but I don't think it can. I don't think it's as big as an impact as we might think it is. Of course, it does help a lot, but from what I remember hearing at different HPA events, it might be one of the last things they look at and will be used as maybe like a reassurance for the application reader, I guess, the admissions reader.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of hit the nail on the head with that one. So you're right, they are the least impactful. And so letters of rec are read at the very, very end, and usually only if the, committee is already considering to invite you to an interview. Basically, they're doing a quick check to make sure nobody has said any red flags or anything weird in your letter. By the point that they read your letter of recommendation, they've already decided that they like you or they don't like you. And so sometimes if they don't even if they read the rest of your application, they decide I don't want to invite this student or an applicant for an interview, they might not even read your letters at that point. So make sure your letters are all positive and they want to say all positive things about you. It happens more often than people think that their letter writers write some negative things. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. You're not going to get in because of your letter of rec only. There's probably other components of your application that an admissions officer may not like. And so letters of rec don't make or break your application. From whoever said that in the chat, you're correct. So again, kind of going back to what I was saying, schools will tend to stop reading your app as soon as they decide they don't want to invite you. But they're important because they're required, but they're not going to get you in and they won't keep you out. So I think that I just want to preface that in by saying, yes, they are important. However, it's not something like your personal statement, right? Okay, good answers. All right. So, for those who've been following for a while and attending all these presentations, I think many of you are really, really familiar with AAMC's core competencies for entering medical students. While they are specifically for medical school, these definitely apply to all healthcare professions. And so, my next question for everyone is what kinds of competencies and skills are your health professional schools trying to evaluate and learn from your letter of recommendation? And feel free to unmute or type your answers in the chat for this one as well. Anybody? Social skills, oral communication, critical thinking, quantitative reasoning, scientific inquiry, written communication. Absolutely. And I think, like, if you, for example, if you get a letter from a professor, they can definitely speak on your like oral communication, critical thinking, things like that. So these are just some things to kind of start thinking about when you're asking your professors to write your letter and thinking about what kinds of skills do I want them to highlight in my letter? What parts of me do I want medical schools, dental schools, PA, nursing schools to know from my letter? And so on the next slide, this is just a screenshot of the top part of the guidelines for writing a letter of evaluation for a medical school applicant. Again, this is really, really helpful for your letter writers, even if you're not pre-med. And so we'll kind of go over like a letter of recommendation request packet later, but I would suggest, send this PDF to your letter writers to guide them on how to write a letter of recommendation for you, especially if they've never maybe written one before. Really helpful for your letter writers to kind of be aware of maybe what should I kind of impact and what should I focus my writing on. So I put the letter guidelines also in the chat. Does anyone have any questions or comments thus far before kind of moving on to the next couple of slides? Okay, all righty. So letters of recommendation requirements in general, they vary by health professional school, but a combo we say is 2 to 3 science faculty, 1 non-science faculty, 1 non-academic source, and then healthcare professional if possible. Now, getting into the nitty-gritty of who to ask exactly, we get a lot of questions about, what counts as a science faculty? Would a research PI count? What about a professor I took a seminar under? I know, Davis, we offer a lot of these like pass, no pass seminars that you can take. The point of a faculty letter of recommendation, so the science faculty especially, is to see if you're academically ready to handle the rigor of your intended health professional school. So kind of taking a step back and thinking, have I demonstrated my ability to handle medical school in this class I took under this professor? And so that can kind of get you thinking about narrowing down who you want to ask. Another question is, what counts as science versus non-science? And so for every health professional school you're going to apply to, the definition is different. So always double check your application system for what counts as non-science versus science. So for example, if you Google, AAMC science GPA, a list of courses are going to pop up that count as science. That list is different for DO schools, for PA schools as well. One person's non-science letter may be another person's science letter, especially if you're applying to both MD and DO. AA COMAS has a different list of what is science under their kind of classification. Again, just highlighting, always double check with the school's websites. Some schools may want very specific letters. So for example, a lot of DO schools want a letter from a physician. There might be some health professional schools out there that may require a very specific letter. So they might say, we want a letter from a chemistry professor. That could be the case. That is not unreasonable of them to ask. So do your research on the schools you're applying to and really dig down in there and see if they have any specific requests for their letters. For the healthcare professional letter, some schools may want one. For example, dental schools may want one from a dentist, PA schools from a PA. You get extra brownie points if they've watched you kind of be in the capacity and work with the patient. They can speak on the health professional that you are going to be. And so those are just some things to kind of think about when you're kind of thinking, who do I want to ask for a letter? If you shadowed a dentist and you really just kind of followed them around, didn't really do much, didn't talk, they probably can't speak too much about you, right? So just thinking about the capacity they've seen you in and what skills maybe they've observed you have and whatnot. The average letter of rec that anyone submits, any health professional school, is about 5 letters. And that also accounts for, if there are schools that have specific requests or letters that they want. So kind of going off of that, here is just not an exhaustive list of all the centralized application systems out there, but these are just their maximums that schools and centralized application systems will take. Now, please do not hit the maximum. This is just, they allot more slots, just like what I mentioned, if there are schools out there that require specific ones. So through these centralized application systems, you're going to request your letters electronically through this system unless you're applying directly to the school. So for example, some nursing programs don't participate in nursing tasks. Some public health programs, genetic counseling programs, these are just some kinds of programs that don't use a centralized application system. So you're going to need to submit the letter directly to the school, and they may have some specific requirements on how you're going to submit the letter. We're going to go over how to submit a letter of rec in the centralized application system in a bit. I have some screenshots and I'll kind of talk through that process and what that looks like on your end and also the letter writer's end. Even though you have, for example, like 10 maximum letters for AMCAS, schools are only going to read the letters they requested, even if they go to all schools. And so AMCAS, you can decide what schools see what letter, but you can see for a lot of these other centralized application systems, they go to every single school. They're only going to read what they require. So if a vet school requires 3 letters and you give them 5, they're only going to read 3. This extra spacing, they give you kind of a buffer room in case, again, schools have specific letter requirements that they want. It is your responsibility to ensure that your evaluation requests are received and completed on time. So if you go through the centralized application system, they're not going to notify you if you have missing letters of rec. So you need to make sure you're following up with your letter writers regularly, reminding them of your deadlines. They're not going to, the CASs are not going to tell you, hey, you're missing your letter of rec. Okay. All right. Any questions or comments? The next thing I'm going to briefly talk about is building relationships with professors. I think probably many of you already have an idea of who you're going to ask, but just in case, I'll just talk a little bit about what that looks like in the Zoom era. Any questions or comments thus far?
So when do you recommend using Interfolio?
Good question. I actually have a slide about Interfolio later. So good foreshadowing. I'll definitely get to that point later.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great question. All right. So I'll just go over this really briefly. Like I mentioned, probably many of you already know who you're going to ask. But I think the big overarching thing is make sure that your professors know who you are. Don't ask your letter to come, like if the professor doesn't know your name and you're thinking, I didn't really ever talk to them, you probably don't want a letter from them. And so some things could be going to office hours, staying after class, going earlier to class, showing an interest in the class, but also kind of revealing things about you. Professors, healthcare professionals, they're people just like you. So they seem really scary, but they're not. So I really just glossed over that briefly. Happy to talk about building relationships more in depth, but I'll focus on more on the once you've decided who you want to ask. So when you're asking for letters of rec, you want to ask them early as possible. And so if, give them at least 2 to 3 months before your deadline to write the letter. And so now would be like a perfect time for you to start asking for your letters, even if you're not submitting until June, July, August, whatnot. Be crystal clear about your deadlines from the very beginning. So in that first sentence, once they've agreed and you're starting the process, you want to put in that first line, like the deadline to submit blank. And I'll also mention this, you want to give them about a month buffer. So if you want your deadline is June, maybe you want to tell them May, just to kind of give your letter writers a buffer. Life happens, things happen. If you're emailing a letter writer and they haven't responded, we always say, email someone 3 times asking for a letter before moving on to find somebody else. Sometimes they're busy, sometimes they miss your emails, but 3 times is pretty much like a good rule of thumb before deciding, all right, I'm going to ask somebody else now. You might be asked to write your own letter of recommendation. So just putting that out there, don't be surprised if that comes up. It's not uncommon for that to happen. I mentioned this earlier, but we say to provide a letter of recommendation kind of packet for your letter writer. Even if they know who you are, giving them as much information as possible about who you are and maybe your intentions helps them a ton out, especially if it's maybe a professor you haven't talked to in a while and you're kind of reaching out again. And so that can include kind of a cover letter, summary of intentions, like why you're asking them to write you a letter of rec. So if it's a professor, talking about, I really learned a lot from this class, you inspired me in this, subject matter, blah, blah, blah. Include your personal statement no matter what draft you're on. So right now, maybe some of you have no solid drafts and they're just kind of getting ideas out there. The personal statement can be a gentle reminder to your letter writer. So you can remind them by emailing and saying, hey, I've updated my personal statement a bit, just sending it your way. So you're kind of constantly checking in and reminding them like, oh yeah, I'm writing a letter for this person. So your personal statement does not need to be in perfect shape when you ask your letter writer to write it. Resume and CV, super helpful, just so they know, who you are, what you've done. Unofficial transcripts, as mentioned earlier, the AAMC letter writer guide. Anything else you think would be helpful in writing your letter. So asking them kind of like, what else, would you need to write me a successful letter of recommendation? And so they might have some other questions and whatnot. But that is just the kind of packet we recommend sending your letter writers and getting that out there as soon as possible, just so they have a collection of all things, about you. All right. This is just an example of one way that you can ask for a letter of recommendation. You can also ask them to set up a time to chat via Zoom, about your application if you prefer to ask, in person. Some people prefer to ask kind of over a phone call or Zoom instead of over an email. One other question that we get is, what if I knew the TA but not the professor? For classes like Gen Chem, physics, sometimes it can be hard when you're in a class of 300 plus people, finding out, building these relationships with your professor. You can ask your TA to write the letter and have the professor co-sign the letter, and that would be acceptable because it's definitely hard in a big college campus to get, know your professors personally if you have large classes. Okay. So that was just the kind of asking for it, building relationship section. Before I move on into getting into how to kind of collect it and what that looks like, I'll slow down and pause. Are there any questions?
Can you go over what exactly to include in that packet once they say yes?
Yeah, I can definitely go ahead and repeat that. So kind of like a cover letter, summary of intentions on why you're asking them to write your letter. That can kind of describe your relationship with them and maybe talk about how much of an impact, if it's a professor, that class had on you. Include your personal statement, no matter what draft you're on. You can also include your experiences too, if you would like, also no matter what draft you're on, your experiences section. Resume and or CV, unofficial transcripts, the AAMC letter writer guide that I showed in the beginning, the PDF, and then anything else that you think or that they may request would be helpful in writing your letter. So sometimes they'll ask for specific things, like, I don't know, throwing it out there. Maybe they might ask for an autobiography, something like that.
So my only question is, like, doing both the experiences section and a resume or CV, like, would it be worth it just to do one of those? Because it seems like they would have pretty much the same info.
Yeah, totally. Some people update their resumes frequently. So if you have that on hand, great.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
if you don't, then yeah, if you're gonna send the experiences section, you're right. That's pretty much like repeating the information. But yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
great question. Anything else?
So I had a question regarding, you said probably 3 times is the best amount of times to email someone before asking someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if this might be too specific, but I emailed the professors I was interested in asking like a couple months ago, about it, probably at the beginning of COVID of last year. So things were
Mm-hmm.
busy. Would you recommend like following up that same exact email with the packet because I didn't include that? Or would you say just try a whole new one? Or how would you approach the, I guess, emails each time? Do you vary them each time or?
Yeah, good question. And I think you're right. It does kind of depend on the situation. Given the fact that it sounds like you asked your professors pretty early in advance, I think sending an email saying, "Hey, I'm now starting to prepare my application. Just wanted to, check in. Would you still be writing to write that letter? And if so, I'm happy to provide you a packet of, and then the next, once they reply, sending the packet of your letter of rec packet."
Okay, so you would recommend sending the packet after the initial response or within that first, here I've also attached this in the first email.
Have you been in contact with them since last year?
So that's the thing. They didn't reply to the initial one, and I kind of just was like, well, maybe I'll just wait until I have the packet ready. So,
Mm-hmm.
and also again, it was like it was probably a wrong time to ask with everything going on, with everything turning online. So yeah, they haven't responded. So I just wasn't really sure how to approach that without being too repetitive or
Mm-hmm.
anything
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah, I would say in that case, ask again. I feel like you don't want to send them a packet before your letter writer agrees, just because you don't want to like bombard them with information about you. So I would reach out again and see how things are going. It's okay if you have to repeat your question because they didn't reply. Maybe they just missed it in their email. I would say same email thread sounds good. That way they can go back and say, "Oh yeah, this person reached out to me a while ago about the same thing."
that. Okay, perfect. Thank
Mhm.
you.
I have one super quick follow-up question. So,
Yeah.
regarding those 3 emails, how long should you wait before sending the second and the third email?
Yes, great question. Great question. I would say about a month. That's about enough time for them to, if they saw it, ignored it. And if they didn't see it, then maybe they didn't check their email. But I would say about a
Thank you.
month. Great questions. Really, really good
I,
questions.
I also have a question.
Mhm.
Um, is it okay to ask for letters of rec now, even if I don't know if I'm applying this cycle or the next one? So, like, is that okay
Yes.
to have a
Mhm.
year-old letter?
Yes, great question. And I'm going to go over that a little bit, but I'll answer it a little bit right now. Again, I think it's never too early to ask. Maybe they won't write it. This depends on kind of how you want to do it. Maybe you want them to write it now and hold it. Maybe you just want to ask and for them to agree right now. If you're not applying for, a year out, maybe, and it's a science faculty, if you ask them early, you kind of feel a little relaxed knowing that they've agreed to write it. And then maybe 6 months before the deadline, you can follow up again. Or you can have them write it now. It's up to you on how you want to approach it. But I think it's never too early to kind of ask them and plant that idea in their head, just letting them know you might not apply this year and it might be like a next year thing.
Okay, so it's okay to ask like this far in advance.
Yes.
Okay.
Good
Thank you.
questions. Yep. Great
I had
question.
a question about like the timing of asking professors, because if you're
Mhm.
asking for this cycle, is it okay asking now since it is finals and professors are probably going to be a little busy, or should we wait until like after finals to send them an email?
Yeah, definitely. Finals, it's probably stressful on them too. So I would say, after finals, during break, those are good times too to ask.
Thank you.
Great questions. Great questions. And I'm glad so many of you are unmuting and we can have, a conversation. All right. Okay. All right. So let's say, your professor, your boss, your PI, this doctor agreed to write you a letter. how do you actually go about collecting that, and what does that process look like? So I'm first going to go over it in the centralized application system. So I know AMCAS is different from all of the other ones. So I don't think I saw any pre-vets out there. I thought there was, so I'm sorry. I'm using the VEMCAS in my example. However, all of the centralized application systems look the same except for AMCAS. So this is a screenshot from VEMCAS, and this is found in the supporting information. And so you can see that you pretty much, they just have like a disclaimer, like you can submit your application once you request at least 3 recommendations. You don't need to have them submitted before you can submit your application. And VEMCAS requires at least 3. So let's pretend I clicked on that create recommendation request box at the bottom, and we'll move on into the next slide. So this is what it looks like when you request a letter in any of a centralized application system. So first name, last name, email, due date, any message you want to add to your recommender. Definitely waive the right to see the letter. So check yes, and then check mark both the other permission boxes. Then you'll have to save it. And then once you click save, I don't think I have the screenshot at the bottom, but it says like save this recommendation request. Once you do so, an email is immediately sent to your recommender. So if you've been in contact with them, giving them a heads up, hey, I'm going to input your information into AA Comas, into CASPA. Wanted to give you a heads up, you will get an email from VEMCAS, CASPA, or telling you to submit the letter through that centralized application system. So confirm with them that they receive that email notification. Sometimes this email goes to spam because it does come from liaison. And since it doesn't come from you, like your name is not going to be in the, any of the, it's not going to come from you basically. So there's a check status tab, and you can monitor the status of your recommendations. So completed recommendations, so once they've uploaded it, they're marked as complete, and then they have a date listed, what time they completed it. So you want to make sure you're following up with your letter writers if they're still marked as requested or accepted. Accepted meaning they've accepted your request to write the letter. So make sure if you're still in that requested accepted, following up with them as it gets closer to your date. Again, making sure you get your letters on time. VEMCAS, CASPA, none of the application services are going to remind you to submit your letters if they're missing any recommendations. Okay, and since AMCAS looks different, I also have a screenshot from what the AMCAS letter writer portal looks like. The main point is you may submit your application prior to letters being received by AMCAS. So they don't read your application, medical schools, and once you submit it, they only read it after, of course, you get verified, you get your test scores, the secondaries, and letters of recommendation. So they read everything once everything's all together. So if you just need your letters of rec by the time you submit your secondaries. So if you submit in June and you get verified in July and you want to submit your secondaries in August, your letter writers can still submit your letter in August. Just putting that out there. Now, maybe not everybody wants to do that. Totally understandable. That sounds maybe kind of scary for some people to have it so close to the deadline. Your letter writers can upload it as early as possible as soon as AMCAS opens, which I believe is May. It's coming up soon. If your letter writers want to submit them early, they totally can. We always encourage early submissions. And again, give them about a month of buffer time. So even if your deadline technically is August, maybe you want to tell them to submit by July, just to account for any wiggle room, any things that may happen. So the different thing with AMCAS is you have to provide a letter request form to your letter author. So AMCAS does not send the letter request form to your letter authors. And it's pretty much like a PDF form, and it has your AAMC ID on it and the letter ID number, so that once AAMC receives your letter, they can accurately match it to your application. So the letter request form must be included for the letters to be matched properly to your application. So that's something to keep in mind for AMCAS. And then you'll see it, it's all laid out, when you go into AMCAS to actually click around and do that. Okay, the next slides I have kind of talk about Interfolio. So I'll pause here and ask if there are any questions about the centralized application systems and kind of how that process works and looks like.
I kind of had a question on like, so if we're following up with our letter writers, are we supposed to collect their letters and then submit that ourselves into the application?
Yeah, good question. So if you're going to apply through a centralized application system, you are never going to see your letter. So they're always going to submit directly through the centralized application system.
So we're kind of just like updating them, letting them know like when our deadline is and like when we're gonna submit the application so that they
Hmm.
be like notice when they're
Right,
submitting it. Okay,
right.
thank you.
Hmm. Good
So
question.
sorry, I have another question.
Mhm.
So like looking at this screenshot, so after we click like submit for the primary app, we can still access this, I guess, and still access the letter request form.
Yes, yes. You can see the status of your letter writers.
Okay, and can we add letter writers still?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So my next slide, I'll talk about Interfolio. So Interfolio is primarily used for medical schools and some dental schools. It's especially useful if you're applying to both MD and DO because they're two completely different and separate application systems. Excuse me. The point of Interfolio is to store your letters of recommendation until you're ready to submit them. Otherwise, you can just use the application system. So if you're applying this cycle and you want your letter writers, maybe you don't need Interfolio because you're going to be applying this cycle and you can just use the application system. The letters remain confidential once you upload them into Interfolio, but you control where they go and when they get there. So your letter writers only submit, what they only have to do is submit your letter of recommendation once to Interfolio, and Interfolio helps get them sent to all of the schools that you're applying to. So you can create a free account in Interfolio, store your letters there, and then you'll have to pay $48 to upgrade your account to like some delivery service when it's time to send them. So this can be helpful if you're not applying this cycle, but your letter writers are ready and they've written your letter. You can store them in Interfolio until it's ready for you to pull them out and send them into, AMCAS, AA COMAS. And I think someone had a question about Interfolio. Does that help answer your questions? Whoever was asking about Interfolio?
Yeah, that helps. So if we're like only applying MD this cycle, it's not really worth it.
No, yeah, because you'll just have them uploaded directly to AMCAS. You'll save yourself some money.
Okay, I had a friend ask me if it was worth getting it, like thinking about if you needed to reapply.
Yeah, it's hard to predict because you don't really know. And I
Right.
guess you'd be creating it, I guess, as safety. So I feel like that would depend on like you personally, if you feel like, oh, I want that safety net. Or another way to look at it would be if you do have to reapply, would you want to reach out to your letter writers again and have them maybe update a little bit, right? Just kind of because you'll change in a year, right? So just kind of weighing, would you rather have a similar but maybe a more updated letter, or would you just prefer to use the same one? Just kind of thing. Just thinking about that.
Okay, that's what I thought. I thought it would be
Yeah.
unlikely for a professor to submit the letter of rec and then like immediately delete it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions about Interfolio? The next thing I'm going to cover is just some like miscellaneous things about letters of rec.
Yeah,
Anything else? Yeah.
Quick question. So you know how you were saying like if we do it directly from AMCAS, for example, you would do that like letter of recommendation request or whatever it's called. So if we're
Yeah.
doing it through Interfolio, so for example, like I'm applying next cycle, so I'm taking that gap year. But
Yeah.
if I start collecting letters of rec now, just for example, how do I do that since I'm not going to do that through AMCAS?
Yeah, so you would use Interfolio if you're collecting your letters now. So you would need to create an account, and then you would invite your letter writers to write and upload the letter through Interfolio. And I believe it's a similar process. Like I'm pretty sure you put their email, they upload the letter into Interfolio, and you can see once it gets there.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. And then you'll pull the letter out once it's ready and send it to AMCAS. Good question.
I have a question about this too.
Mhm.
It might be a dumb question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. If we use Interfolio, do the letters stay confidential? Like we can't see them either?
Not a
And
dumb
it's
question. Great question. Go ahead.
and it's up to us to upload the letters into the application system when the
Yes,
time
so
comes?
so they'll remain confidential, and then you are going to like navigate moving it into the systems. Yeah.
Okay, so once the professors or our letter writers write it and submit it here, they don't have to do anything else. It's up to us
Yes.
to
Yes.
transfer them over when the time comes.
Yes. So you control where they go and when they get there. So that's kind of the nice thing about Interfolio is you don't have to worry about, oh shoot, my deadline, I have to keep reminding them. You're the one like controlling when they get into AMCAS or ACOMAS or whatever other systems. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great questions. Okay. I'm going to cover, I only have a couple more slides left. So the next thing is just some nuts and bolts. All letters need to be signed. They need to be on an official letterhead for school letter. So like if you're asking professor from Davis, can't just be white paper. Davis does not have a committee letter. And so some questions we get is, oh, I need a committee letter. There's no school out there should require one. Sometimes they'll give you an option. We don't have a committee letter just because we have 430 plus pre-meds only applying every single year. And so committee letters, basically it's like it's really hard for us as advisors to write a personalized letter to every single school that all of our students are applying to. So just putting that out there, there should be no school that requires you to have a committee letter. We just simply, that's not something that we offer. Some DO schools may request an advisor letter. So just keeping in mind that that may be a requirement that some DO schools may have. We have a letter writing service. You can submit a request on our form, the HPA website, for one of us to write you a letter, but just keeping in mind, it's really hard for us to write a letter for someone we've never met, or maybe for someone we've seen once or twice. So if you're thinking about asking any of our HPA staff advisors for a letter, we really encourage you to build that relationship with us first, before and just starting to think about if you are going to ask us for a letter. But yes, that is a service that we do offer. The request form is somewhere on our website. Okay.
I have a super cool question. If we get a letter from an HPA advisor, which type of letter would that fall under?
Yeah, good question. I think that would be an advisor letter since we are you're like advisors.
Thank you.